Evening, everybody, and thank you very much to the South Georgia Association for inviting me to give this talk this evening. Apologies that I won't be able to give this live, as I'm currently in Chile at an Antarctic fish meeting. My name is Mark Belchier. I work for the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, where I'm Director of Fisheries and Environment. But for 18 years prior to joining the government, I was the science manager for the South Georgia project and was very much involved in the development of the science program at King Edward Point. And I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking to you about the origins of that project, how the science plan has developed, some of the outputs from the project, and what the future might look like. But I think it's useful, before we talk about the science that's carried out at KEP, on behalf of the government of South Georgia and the Foreign Office, to think about some of the things that were going on around the time just after the Falklands War and the liberation of South Georgia that really led to the consideration of the removal of the military garrison from South Georgia and a return to having a scientific establishment, a scientific base at King Edward Point, noting that Bird Island, of course, remained throughout the course of the 3 weeks of the occupation by Argentine forces in April 1982. But there were some really quite major changes to the governance and management of the region that occurred over the 19 years that the military were garrisoned at King Edward Point. And perhaps one of the most important of these was the coming into force of the Kamilar Convention, the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, of which the UK was one of the main and early signatories. And that came into force almost at exactly the same time as the occupation in 1982. And this gave a framework and an international agreement for how to manage the marine living resources of the region, and is still in force today, although, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it has struggled due to the consensus that's required to reach agreement. It's struggled to reach agreements on things like marine protected areas or krill management in the region. But it came in at a time when there were genuine concerns that if the krill fishery continued to increase in size unchecked, that there could be detrimental impacts on the wider ecosystem. Slightly later, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands was separated away from the Falkland Islands. It had dependency of the Falkland Islands, but became a separate United Kingdom Overseas Territory in 1985 with its own government, the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, and was able to make its own laws. It had its own commissioner, who was the governor of the Falklands, assumed the role of commissioner of South Georgia as they do today. And then subsequently, there was a couple of other developments that were enacted under international laws, under UNCLOS in particular, that enabled a territorial sea to be declared out to 12 nautical miles, and that occurred in 1990. And also around that time, with a recognition that the fisheries in the region that were still quite large were not providing much in the way of income for the government of South Georgia. So the fisheries export legislation in 1990 provided a means of obtaining some revenue. But perhaps one of the greatest bits of legislation that was passed was in 1993, where the maritime zone was extended out to 200 nautical miles to basically form an exclusive economic zone or maritime zone. And this was all of the regions north of 60 degrees. So there was a little bit south of the South Sandwich Islands that extended into the area that was covered by the Antarctic Treaty. And also, coincidentally with this, was the development of fisheries legislation in 1993 that forms the basis, although it's been much revised, of the fisheries legislation that's in place today. And that enables the government of South Georgia to raise revenue through the sale of fishing licenses, but also enables the very strict regulation of the fisheries in the region, but noting that it must be done under the auspices of the Kamilar Agreement, to which the UK is a signatory. Just spend a bit of time reflecting on the state of the fisheries at the time, certainly at the time of the occupation and the intervening period between 1982 and the demilitarization and the return of the Bass research facility to KEP. So we see that fisheries at South Georgia really took off after the end of the whaling era in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when there was completely unregulated fishing and removal after a couple of seasons of pretty much all of the marbled rock cod in the area. And then the attention was focused on a range of other species, including mackerel icefish and other icefish species, myctophids, other rock cod species. And then throughout the 1980s, and in particular over this period, when there was no research facility at KEP, there was a very large increase in the krill fishery, which really only stopped as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And then way through up until about 2001, there was still some krill fishing activity, a little bit of other fishing activity, although by that time things like bottom trawling had already been prohibited. But around about the mid-1990s, there was an interest in the development of a fishery for Patagonian toothfish, this very deep-living, long-lived and highly valuable species that's caught by long-line fisheries around the Southern Ocean and beyond. So it was clear that with the amount of fishing activity and continued interest in krill and toothfish within the waters around South Georgia, that there was a need for a return for research to be considered at King Edward Point that would support the management of the fisheries and the maritime zone. Certainly there was an awareness that following this increased interest in the toothfish fishery, that there would potentially be increased revenue that could support both surveillance and patrol of the maritime zone, but also be invested into research that would inform the management of the fisheries there. Particularly, there was a report commissioned in 1996 for the government of South Georgia. That was compiled by Marine Resources Assessment Group, working with bass as well, that showed there was definitely scope for a licensing regime and regulation regime at South Georgia that would require certain investment in fisheries management and science. Bass was already strongly involved in the provision of data to CAMLR, as indicated, both from running the fisheries surveys regularly, with Inigo often leading on those in the 1990s, but also providing data for the CAMLR ecosystem monitoring program from Bird Island. So there was a huge amount of experience lying within Bass at that time, and of course there was already the station at Bird Island. Bass scientists, as part of the UK delegation to CAMLR, had already been working very well with those other stakeholders from MRAG in particular. And so discussions really started in earnest in the mid-1990s concerning the return of bass to King Edward Point to undertake fisheries research on behalf of the government of South Georgia, not for then NERC, to enable support for fisheries management and to work closely with those other stakeholders such as MRAG and the Observer Programme. Another report that was commissioned in 1996 was for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and was commissioned by Bass once there had been serious discussions about returning to King Edward Point and beyond. Indeed, there was a range of options were provided, as seen here on this slide, including just the provision of scientific program to wider discussions about actually running the facility. There was also discussions about having a separate station at Stromness in order to have an aquarium that would have access to water that didn't have too much runoff and sediment and freshwater contamination. Also at that time there was consideration of having a large ocean-going research vessel permanently stationed at South Georgia. And also, it seems quite outlandish now, and the expense would have been extraordinary, but the possibility of having an airstrip at South Georgia that would allow scientists to come and go much more easily than they can currently when they're constrained to taking a vessel. And I think there were considerations of that being built at Hestersletten, which those of you that are familiar with South Georgia will know that that's a relatively flat piece of land just to the sort of south and east of King Edward Point. And following this, in 1998, there was a UK government announcement to Parliament that there would be a military withdrawal from South Georgia, and that the British Antarctic Survey would return, and that they would operate a research station on behalf of the government of South Georgia. And so around this time, from 1998 onwards, BAS were tasked with the development of a science plan that would support the needs of the government of South Georgia and feed into fisheries management. And at that time, with the toothfish fishery becoming very, very important and also having considerable ecosystem impacts, that was a major focus. But there was also consideration given to a return to studying the abundance and distribution of the larval fish ecology in the region, a need to look more closely at the bycatch species that were taken in all of the fisheries, but particularly the toothfish fishery. And there was also consideration given to the development or further development or redevelopment of fisheries for things such as the mackerel icefish, for which there had been a moratorium on its fishing at South Georgia for a while, but there was evidence that the stocks were recovering. But also a belief that there was potentially viable fisheries for both Martialia squid, the seven-star flying squid, and some of the stone crabs, which could potentially have fetched quite high value. And there was a consideration given to the mechanisms of how samples could be collected. So this would include the offshore surveys, part of the groundfish survey regime would hopefully continue, but also there would need to be interactions with the fisheries observers that were deployed on all of the licensed fishing vessels by MRAG, and who were able to collect samples to be returned to King Edward Point for analysis, but also local sampling within the fjord system in the bays, which were known to be key spots for fish ecology. So in March 2001, 25 years ago, the Antarctic Survey took over the running of the brand new facilities at King Edward Point. There was quite a grand opening ceremony that was largely dominated by the retreating military, Chris Rapley from BAS, and Donald Lamont, the then governor of the Falklands, Commissioner of South Georgia, and Inigo Everson, after whom one of the buildings was named. The accommodation block at King Edward Point had been named. And it was also around this time that I was appointed. I'd been appointed actually in 2000, very fresh-faced me in the middle there. And I went about recruiting the science team, the very first science team of Therese Mulvey, Judith Brown and Simon Morley, but also some long-serving familiar faces from their very first wintering team seen in the bottom right there. And one of the first jobs on arriving quite late in the season, with the later arrival of a lot of equipment all packed up, basically unpack the brand new laboratories. And it was being a little bit like being a kid in a sweet shop. There was so much fantastic new equipment, and we had sort of free rein to install all of this. That included the analytical lab there. The lab is possibly some of the best views anywhere in the world. The construction, design and construction of the marine aquarium, or the controlled temperature facility, which would enable live species that were caught in the bay or on the surveys to be maintained in as close to natural environment as possible, and that's seen in the bottom right there. And then, of course, one of the great advantages was having a small inshore workboat, again, in this case Quest, which was used to do trammel netting and potting and plankton sampling. It could deploy CTDs within the bay. And this has been an small inshore stern trawler, actually, and netter potter, a little Swiss Army knife of a vessel that had been bought from Scarborough, where the owners had tried to sell us the boat along with a place license for the North Sea, which did seem a little bit unnecessary for going down to KP. But it proved a very valuable vessel, and some very interesting finds in the first years of its operation, not least during some of the trammel net deployments, which were replicating some of the work that had been done by BAS throughout the 70s and 80s at King Edward Point. But actually, one of the things that were found quite early on was that adult toothfish at certain times of the year were found quite high up into the fjord systems in the bays at South Georgia, which had never been described before. These were regularly caught from February onwards throughout the winter, and although the animals were very large, in fact the mean length of fish caught in the trammel net sampling was longer than those caught in the fishery at the time, none of them were in a sort of reproductive state, which was odd for fish of that size. But the vessel, as I said, also had many other capabilities, and the A-frame enabled CTD to be launched, and Spencer Carton net hauler allowed nets to be deployed at regular basis, and crab pots that we'd invested in. We also had the rough lab, which was a very good place to do fish dissections and sorting through the large smelly samples, but also had great facilities for cleaning and wiping down. And then the analytical lab on the right hand side there, in the analysis of fish larvae in a very clean environment. Great place to work if you couldn't be distracted by the amazing changing views out of the window. Some of the other early experiments and work that was undertaken were focused on the crabs. So a lot of research was carried out on looking at the fecundity and growth rates of the 3 species of stone crab that were caught off South Georgia. And new information was obtained about the variable fecundities of those species. But also informing the observer program by collating a lot of the information on bycatch species, including a lot of the corals that were brought up on hooks and long lines in certain areas around South Georgia. And also as part of the routine groundfish surveys, there was a return to the deployment of deep operating cameras, so looking at the ecology both of toothfish but also of some of the bycatch species such as grenadiers and skate. And that was a great piece of work to be involved with, using the Aberdeen University deep ocean submersible equipment. But there was also further work carried out on looking at the larval ecology of toothfish. This was the first time that we were aware of that eggs had been fertilized in vitro with any facility globally, and grew and hatched, and we had the trophic larvae hatching in the aquarium facility there. And this enabled us to understand both that the eggs were planktonic, that they weren't stuck on the bottom in clusters like some notothenids. It gave us an indication of some of their development times, and helped inform our understanding of the life history parameters, or early life history parameters for the species, and also anchored some of the points, which was another major focus of some of the early work. So a production aging facility was established at King Edward Point, with the reading of the otoliths, the ear bones of the fish, being carried out both at King Edward Point and in Cambridge. And this enabled the data coming out from this research helped anchor a lot of the growth curves that were being used in the stock assessments at the time for more reliable estimates of biomass and projected biomass into the future. Other pieces of work using a combination of both the information from the larval studies but also from the groundfish surveys was noting where there were high densities of juvenile toothfish, up to sort of 50 centimetres in length, which were clearly very abundant at Shag Rocks. And some of the early work also looked at what the environmental drivers might be of good years of recruitment versus bad years of recruitment. And this is work that actually is still ongoing. There's been many refinements of it, and looking at what the impacts of climate change might be on the future prospects of recruitment for this very important key species at South Georgia. And then in 2009, there was a slight revision, or actually a major revision to the science plan. The science plans have been reviewed every 5 years. So this was sort of the second iteration, or the third iteration, sorry, of the science plan. And at this time, there were a couple of things that were clear. There was renewed interest in the krill fishery, particularly from Norway entering the fishery. It was clear that there wasn't a great deal of high predator monitoring in the area that they tended to operate around South Georgia, which was off Cumberland Bay to the northeast. And at that point also we'd had to say cheerio to Quest, the vessel, which apparently wasn't fit to continue working and sampling in the bay. So there was a different focus, and as well as the ongoing direct fisheries work, Camelot Ecosystem Monitoring Programme site was established at Myviken, where standard measurements and data were collected for both gentoo penguins and fur seals that would enable contrasts and comparisons to be made with the same type of work that was going on at Bird Island. And we knew from the early tracking studies that were carried out from Myviken that there was a spatial interaction between these species and where the fishery was operating, although noting that the fishery, even at that time, was constrained to the winter only at South Georgia. And following the development of this program on these two species, and there had been also a preliminary study done on looking at Rookery Bay on the far side of the Bath, where there was a macaroni colony that was also going to be monitored, but that proved quite difficult to monitor on a regular basis, given the need to get over to the other side of the Bath and cross the mountain range. But there was also a monitoring put in place for the giant petrels all the way around the Thatcher Peninsula and the Green Peninsula, and latterly a renewed interest in elephant seals, starting off by continuing work that Pat and Sarah Lurcock had been carrying out for a long at King Edward Point, and then expanding that using new technologies to other parts of the Cumberland Bay area. So today we have a very sophisticated science plan that is renewed every 5 years, and this is the latest iteration. This schematic shows how the science produced from King Edward Point feeds into policy pathways and management through CAMLAR, through informing assessments for the Marine Stewardship Council of the fisheries, through informing the management plans, both for the MPA, for the terrestrial protected area, and for the fishery management plans for the government of South Georgia, but also highlights how the project links in with both the Basque Coast Science and can inform sort of the UK CAMLAR delegation about wider issues in that whole sort of Scotia Sea region, but also working very closely with MRAG, who now run the Observer Programme, and CFAS, who took on the role of doing fish stock assessments on behalf of South Georgia Government in 2012. Many parts of the science programme that have sort of remained unchanged from the beginning, and I think this highlights the great value in having very long-term data sets. The groundfish survey in particular is an incredibly robust data set of great value, as well as the larval fish, but also a slight shift in emphasis to higher predators and the global interest, I think, in the krill fishery and refining the management of that at South Georgia, so that South Georgia Government can be a real leader at a time when CAMLAR is failing really in many of its objectives. And so one of the other developments, and has become part of the routine sampling at King Edward Point, arose from a Darwin Plus grant that was awarded to BASS, I think at the tail end of 2020, around that time. This involved fitting a scientific echo sounder to the government patrol vessel Pharos, which for the first time would enable sort of year-round estimates of biomass of krill to be made. It would also allow sampling using a small RMT1 net that would catch krill so that the length frequency could be assessed, but also it would allow CTDs to be taken offshore and inshore, and other sampling regimes could be bolted onto it. So here there's a Newston net has now been added to sample plankton in the area. This really has enabled estimates of biomass to be made throughout the year in areas where the fishery operates, complementing the work of the Western Core Box, which was originally started by Bass's offshore biological program and been run for many, many years. But there wasn't a great spatial overlap between that monitoring and where the fishery tended to operate in the eastern part of South Georgia. Surveys, I already mentioned, are of great value, largely unchanged in their design since the early 1990s. And these have proved incredibly useful to show things like the recovery of the marbled rock cod, shown in the figure on the top here, and work undertaken by Phil Holliman and others, have shown that the sort of centre of density of the population of marbled rock cod has spread out from the eastern end of the island, where they were sort of constrained probably by over-exploitation in the late 1960s, early 1970s, have made their way along the coast in higher densities now, and have even crossed over to the Shag Rocks area, which is perhaps slightly contrary to what we might think given the climate change pressures in the region. But this still provides a huge amount of information both on the standing stock estimates of both the bycatch species in the icefish fishery and of icefish itself. and provides a huge amount of specimens for analysis at King Edward Point. And more recently, there's also been the development of the marine protected area. So this first happened in 2012, when legislation was passed in 2011 to enable the designation of a marine protected area around South Georgia. And there have been a number of reviews and iterations since that period, culminating in the last one, which concluded in 2024 and has led to the new designations that you can see in the figure here, which is extended south of 60 degrees, has an awful lot of closed areas completely off limits to fishing, but also has other areas where fisheries can operate subject to all of the very strict regulations and some things like benthic closed areas. So managing the MPA and providing data that would inform on the efficacy of the MPA is also another key piece of work that's carried out at King Edward Point in association with our colleagues from CFAS and Bascor Science. A research and monitoring plan that highlights the research needs for South Georgia was developed about 5 years ago. That basically characterizes the type of research that would inform us on the efficacy of the measures. And only this month, the latest management plan, which contains a huge amount of details on what the measures are designed to do, how research is undertaken in support of those of the monitoring of the MPA, and also things like surveillance and funding is included in that document. So would urge you to read that if you have a greater interest in the MPA itself. So it informs the research that's being done at King Edward Point. And then lastly, looking to the future, we're already seeing a major investment in new technologies. There's been a rapid development in the range of technologies, both autonomous watercraft that can be instrumented and could be used for measuring krill abundance offshore or for listening to whale acoustics. And then ashore, there are a number of different platforms for doing aerial surveys of predators or habitat types. In fixed wing drones and rotary drones are getting cheaper each year. To range can be instrumented with a greater array of sensors, thermal imaging cameras, etc., etc. A lot of this work has been trialled within BAS through Core Science, but is now being implemented at South Georgia, and there's quite a good drone capability now as part of the ongoing research at KEP, doing routine monitoring of elephant seals, fur seals, and beyond. And I think this is something that's just going to expand. But as already noted, and I can't emphasize this enough, the things like the groundfish survey and the larval fish surveys and the long-term monitoring of myvic are absolutely invaluable. They might not necessarily appear to be at the cutting edge of science, but the value in having those long-term standardized data sets to disentangle what might be climate-related change or fisheries-related change is absolutely key to what is done at King Edward Point, and I hope that these will also continue long into the future. And quite prescient at the moment is that there have been a number of recent challenges at KEP, some of which sort of can be managed, increasing tourism, and this is quite a marked increase, probably a doubling of tourist numbers in a decade. They're doubling cruise ships that arrive each season, so that can be carefully managed. Other things such as the arrival of HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza last year, that had devastating consequences for elephant seal populations at South Georgia and some of the other vertebrates there, probably less of an impact on birds, although some were undoubtedly impacted. So climate change is something that we're acutely aware of at South Georgia, and even in the time I've been going there for the last 25 years or so, a massive retreat of the glaciers that I'm sure you're all aware of, and 11 kilometers in the case of the Neumayer Glacier in the time that I've been there. And this obviously has huge challenges both for species distribution and marine invasive species and managing the marine environment. So here's just the penultimate slide, which shows some of the new technologies that have been deployed at King Edward Point. either by the King Edward Point science program itself, or as part of the Winter Krill project, or part of the ongoing what we call the ECHO program. But this has included rotary drones. Here in the middle, Sue Gregory deploying a drone to observe whales from above, including deep operating benthic cameras to look at the impacts of longline fisheries on the benthos and vulnerable marine ecosystems. It's included fixed-wing drones for doing relatively rapid collection of data on elephant seal distribution, for example, at St Andrews Bay. And then the top left there, that's actually a piece of kit that probably slightly outside of our budget at the moment, but is deployed actually by the fishing industry, and that is a sail or a motorized watercraft that is instrumented with a number of echo sounders of different frequencies that is looking for krill distribution, and that can be set off and sailing far away from the fleet to identify where krill might be. But clearly there's a lot of potential scientific application in a piece of kit like that. So I will leave it there. Apologies that I won't be able to take questions now in person, but I hope that's given you a pretty good understanding of what happens at KEP. I have to say that it is one of the most fantastic places to work. I feel very, very lucky and privileged to have had the opportunity of work there and see the place develop over the last 25 years. And I hope I can see you all again soon. Thank you very much for your attention.